Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jared Hornsby, and I'm here today to help answer any general or technical questions that you may have. But before we get started, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Unveiling the Power of Large Language Models in Conversational AI.
Excellent.
Katrina, feel free to take it away. Sorry about that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. What a great introduction. I'm Katrina. I will be helping lead the question session of this podcast, as well as talking about how it's going to work today. The way that our questions are going to work is it's going to be a bit more of a podcast style webinar. So the idea here is we have an expert who will introduce himself in just a moment, who's going to share his level of expertise on large language models, AI, and all of that genius in his mind. As we navigate through these questions, I'm going to ask him a series of some of the most popular questions that we continue to hear from our audience members. And what are large language models? What is AI? How can it help your business? How can you transform it? Hopefully leave you inspired to take something today away to help make your work world better or even your personal world better. There is a question section that you'll see on your screen or the audience chat. Feel free to pop questions in either one of those. As we go through this webinar, we'll ask your questions real time. So if we're asking a question, for example, and asking Sanjay what is large language models, and you want to have a clarifying thought, feel free to ask it right then and there, and we'll be able to answer that. If you'd like to save your questions for the end, that's okay too. We'll also have a question session at the end of this, but of course we may run out of time, so we would love to have you put your questions in as we're going throughout this. I am Katrina. So I am on a customer experience team where I help design customer experience programs for very large organizations. Use AI a lot in my work and see a lot of great examples on how it can work, how it can't work, areas of ethical concern and consideration. So very excited for us to talk about this today. But before I do that, Sanjay, I'd love for you to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Katrina, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Sanjay Mehta. I'm head of industry at LucidWorks. LucidWorks is basically a search and AI company. We support use cases for customer service, e-commerce, and employee workplace. We have made heavy use of AI, including large language models, and happy to walk through a lot of our experience that we've had today and what we're seeing in the market.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, so we're going to start our questions off very broad, and then they'll get a bit more specific. As we navigate through these questions, they'll be in different sections. So as an audience member, feel free to be ready for what the next section is going to come. But again, very podcast style. So the difference of this versus a podcast that you might listen to on your device at home is you get visuals, which is fun. And then you also get to interact with us real time. So please take advantage of that. But the first question here is, what are large language models? Can you provide a brief overview of LLMs, talk a little bit about ChatGPT, Bard, the role in conversational AI? Share with us a quick overview.
Yeah, sure. So the large language models are considered, of course, under the umbrella of machine learning and AI. The technology actually to power them, such as transformers and neural networks, have been around for some time. Actually, now it's until recently with the volume of data available publicly, for example, through the internet, that have allowed these systems to, and especially, of course, the technology underneath that, such as hardware, have allowed these technologies to perform extremely powerful capabilities now, for example, in text recognition, text generation, or synthetic generation, and basically powering very conversational-like, natural-like dialogues with users.
Amazing. That was a great overview. Now, when we talk about LLMs, I think there's a huge misconception that we think that it's like in 2022, when it started for mass use, that's when we think it started becoming developed. And so there's a lot of individuals who may think that maybe this isn't backed with a lot of data, it's new, it's scary, it's something that maybe we shouldn't use and leverage because it hasn't been tested before. But we're here to tell you that actually the history of this goes back quite a bit of ways. Take a look at the 1950s. We started to use natural language processing, and this was done to translate documents from Russian to English. To give you a quick idea, the 1950s is when the nonstick pan was created. So all the way back when the nonstick pan was created, we were starting to develop things that were inputs into this. Moving forward to the 1980s, when you start to see CDs being invented, the n-gram was used to predict sentences, which is a huge transformation, right? We went from things that were being able to take one set of data, put in output another thing to actually be able to start to predict and use learning. 2001, when we started to look at iPods coming into play, we started to see neural networks into play. And then my favorite, in 2018, when Halo Top Ice Cream was created, we started to see both front end and back of text things done. You also see ChatGPT coming to life here. Now, this was not used by the masses then, but it was used by a lot of really brilliant individuals who started to train this, code this, develop it, really make it so it was able to be used by everyone. It was available to consumers at this time, but really in 2022, we started to see it hit mass use. Really popular mass use, you start to see now, like, there's tons of TikTok blogs about how to put prompts in, what to say. You can now post on LinkedIn and it will use AI to create your post. All of these things that are done for mass use in your daily world are going to become a bit more infused. But the idea here is not that in 10 months from 2022 till now do we launch and develop AI and LLMs, but rather this is actually something that's had a lot of validity and testing that's been done on it. And I always get a little bit of comfort knowing that I'm not quite the guinea pig using something, but you can be one of the first in your organization to leverage some of these ideas to really create transformative efforts. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's move on to talk a little bit about the impact of LLMs on conversational AI. So Sanjay, can you tell us a little bit about what are some key examples of how LLMs have transformed conversational experiences and customer experience, employee experience, e-commerce, all of the great places?
Sure. And here, we've kind of created a nice visual for folks because there's a lot of text, but there's so many use cases. But to summarize some key ones we see in the real world right now are using it in customer service, for example, to classify and route tickets, for example, or inquiries for defect detection, for example, based on the text, uncovering certain patterns there. Summarization, for example, too, when there's a lot of content or a bunch of tickets, for example, or support inquiries, summarizing all of that is something it's particularly great at. And I think many of you may already be using it to populate tickets, just as it does with kind of auto-suggesting your email content as you write. And of course, let's not forget all the chatbot and self-service potential applications for those that you leverage that. We're seeing a positive impact on resolution, an increase in resolution rate around 17% based on research from MIT, for example, on the benefits of that. For e-commerce, I think, definitely what we're seeing a lot of use cases around building copyright, personalizing content as well across all your modes, web, email, support, for example. That's a big one. That's rather than targeting or creating all these versions of content, having it build content for you. And then, of course, when it is coming to powering applications like search, enriching your product and tagging product to allow people to better find it or discover it. And again, recommenders and chatbots are another use case that are overlapping. And then from an employee perspective, we're seeing a lot of that in onboarding assistance, training, learning, definitely information applications like information discovery applications, especially for those in research or have a lot of data in the organization for like internal analysts. Definitely productivity apps. We see a lot of that in the HR realm now too, especially as well as for IT support. Recruiting as well. If you think about that use case, a lot of content, analyzing tons of resumes and extracting important, skill sets, for example. And moving on to like analytics insights, let's not forget about the business intelligence side of this, where, using it to build analytics, build insights, essentially really analyze your customer employee journeys, detect trends and risks, because it has ability to look at all that data and summarize it very rapidly.
Wow, what a great overview. I know oftentimes when I think of AI, we often think of it from the consumer's point of view, and we don't think about it from the internal point of view. So I love to hear that it's being used for employee experience and in the vast variety of ways, whether it's through training, recruiting, whatever it may be. Fascinating look at taking it on through your organization to help others. So now we're going to talk a little bit about how do LLMs enable organizations to engage in dynamic conversations across diverse fields. Pretty broad question. So I'm going to switch to this visual so you can help us navigate through the answer.
Yeah, as you probably heard or seen, the current LLMs such as ChatGPT and Bard and a few others, Llama by Facebook, are trained on a huge diverse data set. For example, Wikipedia, anything kind of on the web. And again, that creates more general, that's what they're called, foundational models, right? So they're kind of a starting point. But basically, that allows them really to talk to anyone. And that's where we get into where you want to use some of the tactics, such as the tools that are available in audience and context detection, maybe incorporating a lot of your own user insights based on what you already know about your users, their profile, their segment, audience, to create more personalized prompts, for example. And then again, it could be used to generate that content accordingly based on that context, right? And that context could be a specific field or industry you're in. Does a great job of understanding field-specific or industry jargon, right? And again, narrowing that down to as the customer or the user is interacting, even narrowing it and uncovering more of that context. Vectors, pairing it with vector databases is another interesting one where, for those who may be using this, is where it can expand and chain and relate topics, where it's not directly tied to the specific dialogue, but related, right? And that's actually helpful when you think about recommending other topics. And then let's not forget, you can tune and filter these models more specific to your industry. There are industry-specific models as well, but you can also fine-tune those as well.
Excellent. Let's talk a little bit about the challenges with it. What in general do you see are the main challenges facing the world of conversational AI, and how can LLMs help to address these different hurdles?
Yeah, as it is leveraging a lot of public data, there is obviously a risk of bias, and we call it adversarial attacks, right? Where there's intentional manipulation. You think about fake news and things like that may influence it the wrong way, right? So there's always that risk, and you have to build in some mechanisms to analyze and measure that risk. Of course, all the providers are trying to incorporate as much as they can to avoid that. But if you're thinking about, the trillions and trillions of data points, it's something that everyone has to take ownership of. Accuracy and safety, again, for certain use cases, you think about healthcare or financial services, for example, providing a wrong result could result in life and death, right? Outcomes and losing all your money, for example, those sorts of cases. So, the concept of hallucinations, for example, if it doesn't have an answer, is another issue, right? Where it just manifests an artificial answer that's not correct. So that's something to keep an eye out. Again, these are public broad models. You may have a lot of specialization and specialized content in your own space. And again, that may lack some of the nuances that you need in your field. And again, there's some workarounds that. And of course, data ownership is one that comes up all the time, sensitive data, making sure you don't push out your own, like violate privacy laws, or pushing your own data out there, which may also show up in results to competitors or other folks you don't want to have access to that.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a question here in the chat, and it's asking about how do we get over hallucinations in large language models. And I'm sure you have a great answer, but before we dive into your answer, I'll tell a quick story. So I was using one of the platforms to ask it to come up with quotes, right? We wanted quotes for a project that we were working on things that industry thought leaders had said. And it came up with some really great quotes, but as we started to research it, these quotes weren't actually said by the people that it said it was said by. And then there was recently an article that had come out over a lawyer who had cited them in a case, and they weren't correct quotes. Very, very quickly after, this platform had changed it, where now if you ask it to give it direct quotes and things that maybe it normally would hallucinate during, it will tell you that I can't do that. Here's like some general information. Or what I do now when I come up with a prompt is if I don't want it to, if I really want to make sure it doesn't hallucinate, I put in a quick prompt that says like, blah, 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 blah. Don't make up a response, only go with an accurate thing. And then throughout the entire conversation, it keeps that thread going. It remembers that I don't want it to make up anything. And so by giving it that type of parameters that are really important to you is one very quick way to help with hallucinations. But Sanjay, what are your thoughts on hallucinations?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you mentioned, those are definitely, the prompt is definitely a key one, and making sure you're analyzing your prompts or structuring your prompts to prevent that. We call those a form of guardrails, right? Which is do not allow it to answer anything essentially outside whatever is structured in management structure, but also you have control. And we're going to address this a little bit of control generation. So you actually have techniques called, like, for example, retrieval augmented generation, where you can limit it to only providing answers that exist, for example, in your own data set, or for example, or your own content. There's techniques where you can just use the LLM to build, rewrite your queries onto your own content. But don't also forget, you can always manage the response and before you present it to a user, provide some sort of checking. And we're going to get into a little more of these techniques. I know that's one of the questions here.
Excellent, excellent. And there's a couple of questions here that I know we're going to get to, just as you had mentioned. One of them that's really interesting that Carlos asks is, how much manual optimization is normally required to tune up this accuracy? He's worried about the level of effort invested to keep accurate, good information.
Yeah, depending on your industry and how far, let's think about your corpus of content is separate from what's available publicly, may require more training. Again, there's dozens of models now out there that may, and we suggest definitely testing or evaluating some of these models beyond just ChatGPT or Bard that are most well known, to minimize that, to start up and minimize your training. But again, it would have to be how unique is your content? Is it actually your topics? Are they something that are kind of really available out in the public web and there's some intelligence built around it, or not?
Excellent. All right, keeping on the theme of challenges, can you share some real-world use cases where LLMs have successfully tackled complex conversational scenarios?
Yeah, the big one, because it's so great at natural dialogue or natural fit, is chatbots and virtual assistants, right? And so I think we're seeing a lot of folks already implementing, there's a lot of providers already out there who are offering this type of capability to handle inquiries and more really like a full dialogue. You think about troubleshooting and walking a person through that whole journey, right? And coming up with solutions, and those solutions may include not just text, but it might source products, it might source video, it might source images, right, to help. So that's, I think, a very compelling aspect of supercharging this conversational search type of experience. We're also seeing in education, when I say education, not just schools, but your internal employee training and learning portals, for example. So using it as a virtual trainer, generating tutorials, generating documentation, right? I think a lot of us are doing that. Building, explanations and Q&A, I think, is also really interesting for especially very technical or sophisticated type of topics. Translation's a beautiful one, right? It really is doing a great job of bridging the gap in language. If you think about call centers, I think we see another statistic, around 80% of call centers are dealing with folks in their non-native language, or their language they don't speak. So again, it's a great vehicle there. Marketing is, of course, another great one, where you're not just creating segmented specific content, but you're actually having it generate very contextual, individualized content, which really drives engagement, right? Drives the acquisition of the users. We're seeing a research assistant is a great job of summarizing massive volumes of content. Even within content, we're seeing a lot more of that. What parts of the content are important to me. Document analysis is another big one. whether it's in research or is it in other verticals, healthcare. We're seeing it being used quite a bit there, and of course the corresponding Q&A. And then finally, like diagnostics and advice, it's a great tool. We call that Copilot. You might see out there where it's providing essentially for a given concern advice that a customer or user could use to help kind of improve their performance in the job, for example, or productivity.
Excellent. All right, moving on to the next section here, which is going to be talking about human-like responses. LLMs are known for generating human-like responses. How can organizations strike the right balance between a natural conversation experience, but also ensuring that there's accuracy and relevant responses?
Yeah, a lot of this goes back to what you feed into the model, right? And the two things that let's talk about the controls you have of course, are in your prompt design. We're not thinking about, especially if you're deploying this in here, we're not thinking about you allowing your customers to directly send text without any sort of intervention in between. You're looking at using these APIs, right? And for example, you can structure your prompts, right, in a way. You could seed them, for example, in a way with user preferences to actually make them more personalized is, I think, a big one. And moving into really the parameters you can send, specific instructions on how to respond, what we call temperature, right? So do you want to allow it to be more creative or do you want it to be very rigid? Its tone too is another interesting one, which you can make more dynamic based on the user. And we're going to get in a little more empathy as we talk about more of the use cases here. You can put in penalties, right, for how accurate the results are. And there's a number of other guardrails you can put in when it comes into like how it's generating responses and how accurate. And again, those are tunable or controllable parameters. Again, fine tuning is an important one. If you can feed it with extra data that it may not have access to, for example, within your organization, and that also includes signals, enforcement signals. Is this good? Is this bad? Those sort of judgments you may have based on your own experts internally. And then let's not forget, again, the human has to be in the loop to evaluate the model, right? At some point, you want to continually monitor and evaluate the model. And that also could be where we talk about, your first applications where you have a beta group and allowing them to, for example, score the responses that it's generating. And then let's not forget a continuous feedback loop, right? Where you're always fact checking and response rating. Rating responses basically to continually to improve the model.
Excellent. We have a question from Sarah who's asking, what types of phrases should we test for the highest engagement?
Well, one way we're seeing is folks ask the actual large language model. So you can actually have it generate a lot of phrases or queries or inquiries by giving it some context. For example, tell the LLM, what your business, is, what your audience is, what the topics are, and it will actually generate a bunch of phrases for you. That's what we're seeing a lot of folks actually do, and it's wonderful. Even when you think about customer service use cases of generating FAQs as well. The other is, for those of you who work in maybe SEO and kind of customer acquisition, there's a lot of tools out there to study your audience and what kind of keywords are they using and what's most effective and impacting. And then, of course, look at your own analytics and look at your own user behaviors. For example, their searches and chats, Q&A, for example. And study those, your top K, for example, queries, what's generating the most results, what's not, and use those to build that list.
Another question here is asking, how do we speed up LLMs to allow them to be used in a natural language search engines?
Well, many of them are already there, I think one use case we're seeing is using it to generate embeddings, which again, it does a great job of extracting, for example, entity extraction, and other sort of intent tokens. And so one quick use case is that it just studies the queries, and then you use that, for example, to build your own queries in your own search engine. You can also use some of the intent detection capabilities it has to further personalize and rank the results. So those are kind of really quick ways. And I think we're seeing more folks actually embed it directly into their search bar as one of the results, as you probably see in Google Labs now, right? It's generating an LLM response and then your regular responses. So there's some quick ways to incorporate it beyond, of course, chatbot.
Excellent. What great tips. All right, taking a look now at what are some of the best practices to ensure LLMs respond appropriately to sensitive and emotionally charged inquiries? I love this question.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. So again, they a lot of these are pre-trained. A lot of these models are pre-trained to identify things like sentiment analysis and certain keyword tokens that are considered offensive. And again, it does a great job of understanding context, and that can vary by region, as well. If you go into these tools, you can see it does pick up region right away as well. And there's obviously nuances there, as you can imagine, especially globally. But one thing is, of course, leveraging the topic detection that's built in, and you can actually feed it with keywords or topics that you consider sensitive that may not be in the training. Let's call it the pre-training or seeded training. Of course, you can configure the prompts too, and again, if you want to filter out certain things or modify the responses in a certain way, you can going back to one of our previous slides is around modifying the tone and language to make it more empathetic. And so that's, again, something that's available to you in these models. And let's, of course, think about the training. You might label or annotate, your training data, right? Whether it's, Q&A or other content materials with, for example, labels that, what is considered, offensive, or what's considered compassionate, or, or controversial, for example. So those could be a big one. And let's not forget, these models might not be running alone. You can leverage multimodal, where you take in things like people's reactions, audio, video, or some other great ones to look at as well to kind of supercharge this. And of course, the validation and testing. There's some automated testing tools available to throw a battery of, questions or queries at the system and measure this. And of course, again, human in the loop, let's not forget that. And then finally, the overall analysis. So there's tools to kind of look at all the conversations that occurred and responses that have occurred, and perform kind of a wide analysis again to help you improve or catch some certain things that are occurring in your dialogues.
Fascinating. Yeah, I was recently working with a creative designer, and we were working on creating a strategy for designing different screens. And as we were doing this, of course, we turned to AI for help, as everyone does. And oftentimes when you're in your creative process, you need something to kickstart your juices, right? So we needed a brain dump of a bunch of information. And we're like, help get our inspiration going. And it gave me this very polite, non-emotional answers, blah, 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 blah. And I wrote back to it. I was like, write me a sassy answer. Write me an answer as if you're explaining to a third grader. Write me an answer as if you're mad at me, right? All of these things, right? And it took it and started to use a lot of different emotion, which was the inspiration that we needed. We didn't need it to come up with this technical answer, but by telling it what you want, telling it you want to be more emotional, you want to be filled with all of these other things, if that's what you're looking for, it can be really great inspiration. So I love the way that you phrased some of those tips. All right, moving on to my favorite section of this webinar is around ethical considerations. And the reason why this is my favorite section is this is probably the number one question that I get asked by people who are hesitant to use this. When we take a look at LLMs and AI in general, there are many times that, whether it's in my personal or professional life, I'm like, look at all those great things it did. And everyone's like, oh, but the ethics behind it. So let's talk about it. Let's try and debunk a little bit of the concerns here. So as organizations are leveraging LLMs to enhance customer experiences, what ethical considerations should they be aware of to ensure responsible AI implementation?
Sure. So, again, a couple things, and we kind of mentioned a little bit earlier on too, is bias. Again, bias does appear in many ways in these models, right, and can be unfortunately influenced by negative perpetrators. And so again, diversifying the data sets you bring in, and I think are definitely important. And let's make sure to design prompts that eliminate, bias. It's a big one. I think the other one we want to make sure, and we're seeing this already across a lot of privacy laws with, CCPA here in California, GDPR in Europe. There's a number of others that really are getting onto, what data are you using of mine? How are you using my data? Really eliminating as much as possible the use of personal data in your systems. Again, that can open a huge can of policy violation, or if you're going to, and you need to in certain cases, definitely we see in B2B, for example, getting consent from the user and being transparent about what information you are using and allowing the user to control what data is being used. Again, we're going to see more of that. We already got past this, first the third-party cookie removal. Now we're kind of getting into more granular use cases there. Accountability is also important. Again, problems most likely are going to rise. We all know this is when a computer has not failed us. So making sure that we have some accountability. Like for example, is there a failover? Is who's really responsible for this, right? To make sure these problems arise, or what is a remediation we have in place when something does go wrong, right? That you have to consider those sorts of things. And then, of course, always with all this, you need human oversight. Building some safety nets based on what you've observed in your past, history or your industry, and not also forget, it's going to impact folks' jobs, most likely for the better, right? It's going to give them less monotonous work to do, but making sure it doesn't minimize, you don't really disrupt what they're doing in their day-to-day, and make sure that we're informing them and educating them on the best use of this technology.
Excellent. Yeah, I think it's really important that as we take a look at leveraging any of this, just like any other technology, you can't just put in the prompts and expect it to do everything for you, right? You need to vet it, you need to take a look at it, make sure that there's not the bias that you're looking for, and having that human oversight is so important. These tools are incredibly smart, but they still do need a little bit of human centricity involved in it. Continuing along with the ethical considerations, how can organizations ensure that their use of LLMs align with data privacy regulations and safeguards of that information?
Yeah, I think in the beginning, looking at your use cases, there's definitely a number of audits or assessments that can be used. For example, data privacy impact assessment, DPIA is a common one that we see folks conduct. And, they actually are doing great ones around, LLM-specific ones now, right? But they know kind of what key, data points go into a model and what the risks are, especially when a customer may enter in something that's potentially violating their privacy and they don't realize it, right? That's something to think about in preventing that. Minimizing or anonymizing, as much as you can anonymize is usually the suggestion, right? So again, capturing that any PII and kind of eliminating it from going in there is into the model is obviously key. Again, we talked about transparency. So what data is used, and again, giving the users access to it is big, and this is a big fundamental piece of Web3 too. And then again, safeguards. So you think about your data governance, right? What kind of retention do you have? Making sure you encrypt, and also what do you do, for breaches, like preparedness again for data breaches, which unfortunately are becoming more common. And also, let's not forget, as many of you guys may already be going through, like SOC compliance and those sorts of things, all that data privacy training and employee training is obviously key, since those are the folks closest to all this data.
Excellent. All right, let's move on to the next section here. In the next section, we actually already have a question queued up for it, which I'm happy to hear. This is talking a little bit about leveraging AI for that customer impact. How can organizations effectively leverage AI to improve the customer experience?
Yeah, there's a number of ways. We're seeing really from what the customer actually sees to what they don't see, but really starting from enriching your underlying content, whether you're in e-commerce or customer service or in general, a general site for employees, for example, intranets. It's the ability for it to generate and enrich content. Especially in e-commerce, we're seeing a lot where it's enriching product data, for example, descriptions, adding metadata to drive more of the utility and visibility, for example, of that product. We're also seeing a lot for marketing, kind of generating content for campaigns, or improving and augmenting the existing content that exists. And again, going back to the idea that all this content can be really personalized. So everyone has their own unique one-to-one version, which I think is very compelling across the board. Improving relevance. So again, when we think about this supercharging NLP, and we talked about the ability to translate and building embeddings, which again are really extracting topics and putting them into really a multidimensional space and kind of seeing how interrelated. You guys might be working with knowledge graphs or graph database, kind of looking at the interrelatedness of topics. I think that's extremely powerful when you think about driving more of a conversational experience. And of course, virtual assistants enhancing your search is a really big one for that. Personalization is another one. Just going back to creating either a one-to-one content or just a dialogue. And let's not forget being able to use that the LLM to generate recommenders, whether they're product or content or multimedia, right? Any sort of thing. It does a great job of that, throughout really the entire customer or employee journey. And then finally, we're seeing a lot of it using it to generate insights, so you can build your strategies, right? Where you can actually analyze all these customer behaviors across all their touch points, analyze your market, again, all that market data, again, available on the web, all across all these modes to build really powerful insights on how to really build your customer interactions, in this case, build what we call customer intelligence, product intelligence, market intelligence.
Awesome. Excellent. All right. So now we just talked about some of the great things that it can build. Let's talk about what some of the pitfalls are. So what are the pitfalls of over-relying on AI in customer interactions, and how can we mitigate these? Yeah,
one thing we've heard, observing is more, for folks who have really high-touch brands, it may alienate certain customers when you're kind of forcing them down that sort of AI path only, and really pulling the human aspect out of it. So I think that's something to consider. Again, a lot of us want to improve service, but let's not forget that there's an outlet, or for these folks who really want to speak to someone. That's what we call balancing it with human interactions as much as possible. It does run into limits when it comes to problem solving. As it can't be as creative as a user or a human, right? And so that's, I think, a big one. Of course, you want to continually train it. So as a human is being involved in a complex problem solving task, you can use that and train your system to continually improve. But really, that you may be looking at making sure you route it, as I think many of you may already do with your chatbots, route to a human when it certain escalates or the answer can't be resolved. And again, the other one, inaccurate responses, is one that we know. We mentioned hallucinations that can cause customer distrust. So make sure you're monitoring and validating your response with human oversight. We talked about guardrails as well earlier, right? Which is making sure you control the generation with certain rules that you may have in place. And the other piece, even though it's broad and you can add context to it, when you get really specific in a specialized, specialized needs or industries, it may not be contextual enough. Making sure that you give it, make sure you give it enough data from your own audience interactions, to help it improve its contextual understanding is, I think, really key.
Yeah, absolutely. Two kind of interesting points that I recently found here. When we're taking a look at individuals who are using this, there's often the number one question I get asked is, what demographic is this targeted towards? Is there a certain age of people that are using these tools compared to other ages? And the fascinating thing that the research has shown is that there's actually not. It really depends upon more on your value graphics, right? What do you value in life? What category of lifestyle do you fall in? So often we think that people fall into like Gen Z thinks this, and millennial thinks this, but in reality, you actually only agree with what 13% of people in your same age range agree with. When we take a look at things that are a bit more complex, like value graphics, are you a very nomadic person who likes to venture around the world versus are you a tech savvy person? We see in those categories, you agree with 83% of what people in your same value graphic agree with. So as we try to look at organizations who are starting to use AI in the customer center, the number one recommendation that I have is don't look at the age breakdown of the people who are entering your call center and say, well, it's Gen Zs, therefore we have to use AI-like responses. What we started to find is that actually it depends upon what their level of expertise is with the topic. For example, if you're talking to students who maybe don't have any experience with financial services, right? This might be the first time that they're interacting with that space. They may call in because they need someone to explain it to them at a level that they can understand. If you're talking to someone who's a bit more of an expert in that space, they're happy with an automated bot answer that's going to pull up an article because they can understand what it's saying. So really focus in on not so much ages, but more on really think about what your audience looks like. The second kind of fun story here is talking about that human touch and limited problem solving. We were talking recently with some Gen Z individuals who were talking about their hesitancy to use AI. And I asked them, why are they hesitant to use it? And her response was, well, I needed to write an essay, but thinking about what the prompt would be took me longer than actually writing the essay myself. And so there's this thought that you have to put in this most perfect prompt and not even try the tool before you do. Just try it, use it, leverage it, see what happens, and you'll continue to get smarter as the tool does as well. So love the way that you had approached all four of these categories here. We're going to move on to next talking about the future of AI. And as we do so, I have a question here. The question is asking about how can curated vector databases be used to improve the accuracy and the relevancy of a response?
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of this actually as an initial use case for search around internal workplace, for example. You think about financial services when we're thinking about lots of large documents financial reports, K1s, analyst research. And so you think about that use case, just to give more of a practical example. Using it, first of all, to build glossaries or summarize the entire universe of data is massive, and that creates a really easy way to access. Think about building a dynamic navigation interface over all that data, which didn't exist before, by exposing all the tokens or concepts that are in there for you to rapidly narrow down to what you need, kind of similar to what we would do with facets. The other is obviously looking at it and building embeddings in a vector space, for example, where it's taking a number of things, not just what's in the document and extracting embeddings, but query pairs along with those documents. So what are folks asking and what documents they're looking at, and building sort of that set of embeddings to improve search. And then I think one the concepts I talked about before is finding related topics or branching into other topics that are related in that space. Kind of what we call the nearest neighbors approach is a big one. And again, building labeling or building metadata for example, on your existing documents is another use case we're seeing where you can take embeddings and build that to help improve, the search altogether.
Excellent. Really helpful. All right, continuing talking about the future of AI, what opportunities do advanced AI capabilities, including LLMs, present for organizations to stay ahead of the competition and innovate in their respective fields?
Yeah, LLMs again have access to a lot of all this public data. So I think looking at it from brand intelligence, enhancing your brand is a big one. First, so folks are aware of what you do, right? Getting to your audience, and so informing your strategy, building your marketing and content, understanding next best is kind of a big one. Asking it kind of to help inform your strategy should be is a big one. Where there might be a product opportunity or market or audience opportunity, I think is a big one. Of course, we mentioned quite a bit here is around enhancing experiences. Not just, from, adding it to a chat bot or improving your search and personalization, but think about all the other sort of tools now that you might be able to create that allow you to innovate your experience to drive more audience and engagement. Again, it's a massive tool to improve operational efficiency, right? Not just around customer experience, but really across your enterprise. And finally, it's a very powerful tool just to generate overall intelligence. For example, we're seeing more folks using it now to inform their product innovation. Like what features of products are folks really interested in? How are they using certain products, or where is there a product gap? I think is really interesting. And of course, all the predictive analytics is another big one.
Excellent. Very helpful answer there. Now we have a question from our chat. Trying to see if I can pull it up. Okay. It says, can you speak to the effectiveness of using LLMs when the prompt or query is not conversational? For example, you have a call center agent who might not have the time to write a full form question, and then maybe they rely on keyboard and shorthand searches.
Yeah, again, there's tools where you can use both your traditional, for example, knowledge management search and route certain queries. We call it, really a kind of a query routing approach, which is maybe certain queries are better answered by certain tools. And so there's one approach that's there. You can also, with the prompts, regardless of what is entered in the prompt, you always have the ability to add additional data to the prompt in the API, right? Like I mentioned, extra structure, maybe customer history is one we're seeing more of, or what products they own, what's their future, like past interactions and conversations, can also be fed to help power very simple queries with much more rich results. So those are just a couple of examples that could be used as well. And then I think we've seen others where it actually is generating essentially or guiding the user with topics and tokens into a dialogue without having them really have to enter much keywords at all, where it kind of just builds builds that sort of interaction by them clicking on topics, as right, presenting them like a menu of topics and then allowing them to drill down. So there's definitely a few ways around that.
Great. All right. Now we're going to move on to our next section, which is, hopefully that clicked right, focused on partnering with organizations for maximum capabilities. So what steps can organizations take to prepare themselves to be fully leveraging the capabilities of LLMs and other advanced AI technologies effectively? Great visual on the slide.
Yeah, it's a lot, but to kind of go through this quickly, really prioritizing your use cases. It can solve so many problems. And I'll hit on one thing around, maybe identify your low risk use case first. We're seeing a lot of folks maybe try it on an internal app where the employees get familiar with it, and you're actually testing it on data that doesn't risk your revenue, right? For example, or service. facing, customer facing. So that might be one. But again, making sure you know where it's going to generate the most value for you is also to be considered. Making sure you have the right teams, right? You do need, ideally folks that are cross-functional from AI or your ML team, data science. If not, you can outsource these. Folks who are experts in the domain that you're dealing with, right? If it's a specific audience you're addressing, right? An industry you're addressing, making sure you have those folks. Let's not forget the UX, right? It's all about how you're presenting these results, and there's so many different ways it can be incorporated in your experience. And then, of course, security, privacy, they all should be part of that team in the implementation. The tools, I think, is an important one, too. Remember, there's now dozens of LLM models and other corresponding technologies, right, that can come together to build a solution. So, making sure you don't just go with what everyone else is going, but what's right for your organization, right? And again, there's organizations that can help you do that to make sure it's the most beneficial use, especially when you want to balance cost, right? These can get expensive, and so using that, I think, is very important. Identify and prepare your data. Again, this is going back to data governance. What can you share? What do you have access to? What puts you at risk? Making sure you have all that. And it's not just content, it's also behavioral data, transactional data, things that we consider to be signals, call center interactions, for example, even voice interactions that can be transcribed, video interactions that can be, transcribed into text. There's so many different things, making sure you bring it all to the table, again, across all your channels and modes. Instituting guardrails is another one. So making sure that you put in your business logic to make sure you avoid, like you probably have business logic already in your search, for example, or in your content rules, in your engagements that you have in your customer experience. So making sure those are definitely carried over into the platform, right? So that we're making sure we're not showing something that we're not supposed to, especially when there's some rules or restrictions in place. Testing, again, pilots, we suggest everyone pilot this, perform a split test against your existing capability, make sure it's making the impact that you wanted, that you get an ROI that you want, right? Because again, this costs money, you're spending money to make money again, right? Or save money. So there's some of that. And then again, user experience is definitely really critical, right? You can really fail at this if you're not doing a great job of making it easy to use and making it aligned to what users in your audience are actually need, right? Based on what they've told you or what you've analyzed. And then finally, making sure everyone involved in your own team is educated or continually learn the actual practical applications and adoption. And you'd be surprised, your employees will surface a number of use cases that you might have not thought of at the top, which is great. That's something we do, is like kind of source a lot of ideas internally and ask our customers to do so as well.
All right, now we're going to switch and talk a little bit about specific skills or organization changes required to embrace AI and conversational AI fully.
Yeah, and breaking down kind of what we went through just in the last slide was more, AI, machine learning, data scientists, again, are used more to develop, train, even identify the right models and then fine tune them on an ongoing basis. So those are key. Again, as this field evolves, there's probably more interfaces that allow business users to really do a lot of this, but not at this point. Right now, a lot of it is, the responsibility of ML or ML engineers or data scientists. NLP, again, natural language processing experts, search experts, I think are really key if you're going to develop search conversational applications who really understand dialogue, linguistics, right? And even other topics like translations and those sorts of things. Product manager, someone who really needs to define the features and functionality and kind of own it, right? From a perspective, it could be also kind of a co-product project manager, really is responsible for getting the consensus on what needs to be built, what the features are, and delivering. And I mentioned, the user experience. Again, a designer, a page developer, for example, too, or app developer, if you're doing mobile. Those are, again, definitely folks that are critical. And then finally, you need the business stakeholders or owners, right? Everyone who it impacts, but particularly the ones who are paying and realizing kind of they have accountability on the performance, right? And so that's the whoever the stakeholders may be, right? What groups there are. So those would be the key ones we see.
We have another chat question from our audience asking a bit, backtracking to one of your previous questions, talking a little bit about how do we ensure the results returned are actually correct. They say that their ChatGPT experience has displayed a significant amount of wrong answers.
Yeah, we're that definitely. So there's tools. Again, aside from human judgment, there's that, but there's tools in place, going back to control generation and guardrails. So there are things you can do either in the prompt or in the actual response itself, depending on, where you're almost like testing both, where you can actually eliminate false answers. And false answers may be, are you trying to answer questions that are based on your data, or is it based on public data, right? And again, if it's your data, you can limit it to only answering questions on your data. That's something we see a lot of folks using, and that's one of those techniques is called retrieval augmented generation, RAG, is something you may want to look into. And then again, going back to the temperature, for example, in your prompts, you can actually tune the temperature setting, for example, to make sure it does the best job to provide a very basically reduces creativity in responses. That's, for example, one of those others. And then ultimately, you can always filter the responses themselves as they come out, if that's something you have facilities to do, to ensure that, and run automated types of tools. There are tools to do some fact checking, for example. Citations, I think, is important, and we're seeing a lot of that coming out. Is making sure everything it responds to has a citation, so you can do some fact checking. That's obviously a common one, and then explainability, making sure explainability is built in to understand, when you're using it, kind of where and how and why it generated the result it did, right? Like what data was used, for example. So those are some of the things that are available to you.
Excellent. All right, we have time for our wrap up and just one last question here. So I'm going to ask the question that we just had pop in, asking if you could clarify or say a little bit more when you say the word penalties. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so a penalty is a setting in some of the large language models that essentially restrict it from, or basically punish it for incorrect answers, for basically reducing, again, its creativity. Very similar to temperature. So again, the language may be different based on the model you're using, but again, it basically penalizes the model for creating results without minimal citations, for example, or any sort of creativity, like restricting the creativity without having any kind of real source to borrow from. So that's kind of the idea. So temperature and penalty are kind of the two tools you would look into to manage that. And there's actually different kinds of penalties as well, and that's something to definitely look at to control some of that.
Excellent. All right, moving on to just our wrap up here. So let's take a quick chat and talk about these two questions. First one is, what are some key takeaways you'd like for our audience members to remember? You have a lot of really great information. If the brain's like mine, we might forget a little bit of it, so slides will be sent out afterwards. But what is one key takeaway? And then secondly, can you share any final insights, recommendations for organizations looking to embark on their AI journey responsibly and successfully?
Yeah. I think low risk use cases, again, is what we're seeing. That's more being responsible to your organization, right? And not putting, just because there's a lot of hype and it's popular and everyone's doing it, making sure it works for your customers and your employees. So that's a big one. Doing a beta group, I think, is critical too, right? To make sure you're running it against a select group is common, and you already see example OpenAI and Google doing that in their big models. Choosing the right model, there's different models that are specific for different industries. I kind of like looking at the right tool for the right job. You can combine models. Let's not forget that there's models for voice and vision that can be used, as I mentioned, to make even more of a powerful solution there. So don't just be stuck on ChatGPT. Look at things like Hugging Face. There's Llama from Facebook now that's getting a lot of popularity, and then there's a lot of industry-specific ones, open source ones as well. Institute governance. Let's not forget making sure you have your stakeholders, data privacy, data governance, privacy, security. I mentioned explainability, monitoring. Don't just go out there without any of that, or you're going to run into a lot of trouble. And limit really what the potential is as well. And then, of course, continually observe, measure, making sure you're attributing the impact. I think we see a lot of folks not properly measure the actual financial impact or metrics or outcomes. And that's an important one. And also continue to test it on different models, test different models or different modes, like not just your chatbot or search or apps. There might be a lot of other areas you could use it across your organization. And it's not limited to just the customer experience, or employee experience. Think about all the sort of operations you might have across your enterprise where you might be able to leverage this.
Excellent. Perfect. All right. Well, that concludes our time for asking you questions. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. It was incredibly brilliant. I'm going to turn it over to Jared to give us a quick wrap up before we end our call today.
All right. Thank you so much, everyone. That's going to be our time for today. I'd like to thank Sanjay and Katrina for being here today, and for LucidWorks for sponsoring today's webinar. Last but not least, thank you to all of you in the audience for your time and attention today. Today's webinar, as we mentioned, was recorded, and you'll be receiving a link to that recording in a follow-up email. So keep an eye on your inbox for that. But in the meantime, thank you all so much for your time and attention, and we'll see you on the next one.